On a freezing Christmas Eve, a woman in rags steps off a lonely train, with nowhere to go and no one to trust. She doesn't know that the station master and his young son will change her life forever, and that one day she'll risk everything to save theirs. The wind came down off the plane sharp as a drawn wire. It had the cold, blunt honesty of weather that did not negotiate. Thomas Grady felt it through the cracks of the station house as he refilled the coal box and set a fresh kettle on the stove. The little town called Dry Creek had a single track and fewer houses than the map on the county line suggested it should. In some years the track was the town's lifeblood. In other years, it was just a line across a halting world. Thomas kept the station and a small store that served what traffic passed that way. He was not given to words. The ledger under his hand had a neatness to it, and he liked things balanced, accounts, seasons, a stack of flour sacks. He liked his son's laugh because it filled empty rooms. Sam was 12. He had hands that learned quickly and a mouth that kept up with them. He could fix a harness, split kindling, and coax a stubborn kettle into boiling with the patient attention of a boy who had watched a man do the same tasks for years. The boy's mother had died when he was small. Thomas did what the widow's life required. He kept the house warm. He baked bread on mornings when the sky promised cold, and he taught Sam what was necessary to keep gear and life from going to rust. There were other men in town who could tell you Thomas's ledger balance by heart. There were fewer who could tell you anything about his dreams, because he kept those close and practical, like a pocket knife. It was the kind of winter that announced itself early. The light came thin and metallic, and the land turned to hard white as if the world would be easier to read that way. On the eve of Christmas, a train came in on schedule and then lingered like a slow animal. Thomas and Sam went to the platform because trains were the town's visitors and its news. They came when they could, and they watched the snow swirl and the iron steam hiss from the engine. When the coach door opened, a woman stepped out, who looked as if she had been measured against hardship and found wanting in many places. Her dress had been fine once, but that was a memory sewn back into usefulness. The sleeves had patches, the collar showed many small stitches. A knitted hat, too small and misshapen, lay in the crook of her arm. Snow clung to the hem of her skirt like frost on old combs. She looked at the station as if she were reading it to understand if it would hold her. Her hair was chestnut and braided, though the braid had loosened, and a few strands had escaped to curve against her cheek. She carried herself not with the airs of a woman who meant to take, but with the small, steady air of someone who had learned to estimate how much she could hold before something slipped. Sam saw her first, because a boy watches for possibilities like a man watches for trouble. "Pa," he said, the word rising in his young voice. "She's come." Thomas had placed an advertisement months ago. In a way many did in those days. A life could be brokered by a note and a promise. He had been honest in his letter. Single father, small station, work to do, food to share. And the agency in the city had answered that sometimes there were women who wanted a chance to leave the noise of town for a steadier place. He had not known what the woman would look like when she arrived. He had hoped for a calm presence and someone who could help keep a house from forgetting it belonged to people. He had not wished for riches. He had wished for a companion who would not be frightened by a child's scraped knees and a stove that needed coaxing. The woman's name was Clara. She accepted Thomas's gloved hand with a simple nod, and the look in her eyes that first night was cautious hope. In the station house, with the stove keeping the room near as warm as it could, Sam offered her cocoa before Thomas could speak. She accepted, and when the warmth reached her fingers, the color came back into her face, as if someone had painted it anew. She told them, in small sentences, that she had come by an agency, and that she had been in Chicago once, and had left because the city had been a place that took more than it gave. Thomas listened, and did not ask the pressing, nosy questions that lesser men might. He had seen in his years of ledger and errands the way people bent under too much judgment. A man like him measured courtesy in the weight of a gaze and the steadiness of a hand. There was distrust in the town, which was a normal thing in a place like Dry Creek. A mail-order match carried with it the scent of bargains and tricks. Men in the saloon offered opinions to anyone who would listen. Women in the bakery weighed facts against compassion and found the latter too often wanting. The pastor came by with a dish and a blessing because he had been raised with the idea that you help people when they come to your door. The town did the thing towns in the frontier did. It supported one another in little practical ways, because survival invited generosity, but gossip was free. Thomas and Clara married on a plain porch beneath a sky spattered with stars. There was no display and no extravagance, just a pastor and two men who watched quietly, the kind of union that was a promise as much to the child as to each other. Sam, already in the habit of being able to bear his own burdens, stood with a straight back and a grin that suggested something more than cheer, something like belief. Afterward, they ate a thick stew and set a small, patched quilt over the bench where Clara slept the first night. It was a modest beginning, the kind that grows fertile when tended. Clara's work was ordinary, and it was heroic by small measure. She mended coats with a diligence that made the hems look as if they had always been a part of the cloth. She learned how much salt to put in the bread so it would rise properly in a low oven. She washed the curtains and sewed new buttons on the boys' shirts. She made a place where things were useful and where laughter could sit at the table without being scolded. Thomas watched her in a way that sometimes unnerved him, because he found he was learning to appreciate the slight tilt of her head when she listened and the way she set a cup in front of him without fuss. He came to trust her in the way a man trusts a bridge that has held his weight once. And then again, trust was not made by words so much as by the daily action of not failing. It did not take long for Clara to be accepted by most of the town. People tend to love what helps them, and she helped in 100 unremarkable ways. She patched Mr. Harper's coat, took in a seam for Betsy the dressmaker, and once drove out in a sleet to fetch medication for an ailing neighbor. There were men who still whispered, voices that used the town's worst instincts as if they were scripture, but most folks saw what was plain. A woman who had come with little and given what she could, who had laughed at the boy's bad jokes and scolded him when he was careless with a knife. There were things in Clara's past she carried like a shadow under her skirt. Once, in the hush of evening, Thomas asked about Chicago. She paused at the window and watched the road disappear into white, and when she spoke it was quietly. "I left," she said. "There were things there, people who thought they could own a person's life. I didn't want to be someone else's claim." She held back details the way one holds back a map of dangerous places. Thomas felt then that she had endured more than grace could easily excuse, and he felt gratitude that she had chosen their hard, honest life, instead of whatever softer cages the city might have offered. The years folded in like the pages of a ledger once you learned to read the columns. Sam grew, and with him grew a steady competence. He learned telegraphy from a traveling man who took pity on the boy's curiosity and taught him how to watch the tick of dots and dashes until they made sense. He could do the calculations for the shipment of flour and knew which cows were likely to bear calves in the spring. Thomas and Clara planted a small orchard, which yielded apples that were tart and fragrant, and saved them through the winter by a trick Clara used that let the fruit keep without freezing. They had a life that was not grand, but it was theirs, stitched together by small rituals and mutual labor. Trouble came in forms both petty and sharp. A letter from the agency once arrived with accusations from a man in Chicago who claimed Clara had deceived him and other families. The claim was ugly and without obvious proof. It was the sort of noise that could gnaw at the fragile trust a community has built. Men at the saloon read the letter with a kind of vulture appetite and measured Clara's presence against the new story. People asked, in ways meant to iron out guilt by implication. Clara endured it the way she had endured the weather, without dramatic complaint but with a private ache. Thomas encountered the suspicion of neighbors with the sort of mute force that is like a wall built slowly stone by stone. He did not respond with equal malice, but he held to the truth he knew. He had married the woman, and that mattered as much as any letter. Then a winter came that the old men of the town would tell with a slow shake of their heads. The snow fell deep and hard, and a wind turned from a nuisance into a thing that could unseat a person's balance. Roads were hidden under a white wash, and the telegraph wires hummed with the groan of frost. Thomas set out on a run for the mill. There were sacks that had to move, and obligations that do not let up, even when weather does. The wagon wheel snapped sharply and the axle gave, and Thomas was left with his horse fretting beside a broken wagon, the heat sinking from his hands like a breath left half said. He did not panic. Men in such places develop a quiet capacity to wait and to mend. What he did not see at first was the way a blizzard can make a person small as a pebble. Clara, who had become accustomed to a set of small responsibilities that included the man she had married, saddled a pony and wrapped herself in a heavy cloak. Sam begged to come along at first, but Clara would not have it until the boy had the sense to stay in town to check the stove and the kettle and the lanterns. She rode into the white that had swallowed the road and found Thomas not far from where the wagon sat, like a broken shadow. He was half buried, his breath coming ragged. Clara set to work with nothing but a rope and a patient insistence. She shored a shelter with the canvas and the branches that were exposed and cradled him until he warmed. The storm could be cruel in its indifference, but the human body has heat when two people lend it. The townsfolk who had been wont to judge found a different name for Clara after that. They stopped using phrases like, "Well, you know how those women are," and instead brought coal and meat and the wordless help that villages cultivate. The man from the saloon, who had been most boisterous in his judgments, came with a hat in his hands and a quiet manner because he had seen what loyalty looked like at arm's length and could not deny it. There are things a man may do in the open that make town murmurs vanish. Action clarifies what words obscure. Life, stitched from small work and small mercies, moved on. Sam grew into a steady young man. He took a post at the telegraph office and later married a woman who had the laugh of someone who had lived by the sea. They sent photos back with strange squares of their world and letters that smelled of different kinds of dust. Thomas and Clara aged together, their lives a slow, contented arc. Clara's hands, once quick and sharp, softened with time but retained a steadiness that came from patching not only cloth but life. Thomas's beard went gray at the temples, and the creases at the corner of his eyes deepened into the map of years. There was a season when Clara's memory began to fray like a well-worn shawl. It was subtle at first, names that fell out of reach, a word slurred into silence, a pause. They went to the doctor who came out from the county, a good man who spoke with the delicacy of someone who had read what illness does. The diagnosis was not a single thunderclap but an accumulation, a gradual fading that left the heart intact, even as it took certain corners of the mind. The town rallied in that way small places do. They brought pies and took over chores. The pastor read verses and the men mended the fence. There was a humility in their help that made Thomas proud and absurdly grateful. On an autumn afternoon when the air was clear and the orchard hung heavy with fruit, Clara walked to the old apple tree and stood with her palms on the bark as if listening for a story. Thomas found her there and watched the way she held herself, steady but quieter than before. They did the ordinary things together, breakfast, a slow walk, a ledger balanced in the evening light. He would read to her sometimes, and she would smile at a line she had once loved and now could not call to mind. When she passed, it was not with drama, but with a kind steadiness, like that of snow melting into the ground. Sam and Thomas held the house as if it were a small altar. People came with casseroles and stories that stitched the wound with memory. Thomas kept the station because it had always been, in a way, the scaffold of his life. The ledger stayed on the table and the oil lamp burned low in winter nights, the light a small insistence against the dark. He planted a row of lilacs in front of the station out of a private, perhaps foolish hope that living things could be persuaded to remain. He did not make grand gestures. He sat in the window and watched the road disappear into white like an old habit. The photograph of Clara was kept in a small frame. He carried it with him sometimes and would lay it near the ledger and show it to visitors who asked for a face to the story. Sam, who visited when he could, sat with him and spoke of the telegraph wires and the calls he had routed, and the children of his own who would climb the porch steps and ask about the man who had kept the town's books. Their life softened into a rhythm that asked nothing of miracles. There were still storms and the plains still required respect, but there was comfort in the way the everyday tasks fit together. Thomas felt his own days gather to a point. He kept the ledger in order, checked the stove, smoothed the blankets. He drank his coffee and thought, often, about the first night when a woman in rags had stepped off a train and into their small life. He thought about the slowness of love. It is not the sudden blaze of fireworks, but the way two people can be present to one another until the presence itself is a kind of proof. One winter night, much like the one when she had first arrived, Thomas felt the softness come upon his chest that meant the end was near. Sam sat close by the stove, older now, with hands that carried new scars and new stories. Thomas took the photograph of Clara and looked at it until the lamp burned down to a low whisper. He remembered the steady way she had mended things, the fierce protection she had shown when danger came, the small acts of bravery that were the building blocks of their life, a warmed hand, a baked pie, a stitch made to hold. He thought of the road that had once disappeared into white, and of the way that the plain had given them a life that was modest and honest. When he closed his eyes, it was with a fullness he had not expected. There was grief, and there was gratitude. The town marked his passing with the same quiet dignity with which it had marked Clara's, neighbors bringing food, hands steadying the small affairs, memories traded over warm kettles. Sam took up the ledger and placed a new photograph beside it, Clara's braids still visible, the line of her mouth steady. He wrote the numbers in their box with the same care his father had shown. The town went on because the world does, and because people choose, sometimes quietly and sometimes not at all, to keep living in the small, steady way a life asks of them. The tracks kept cutting through the plain and the trains came and went. New faces arrived at the platform. Some were bright with youth and the reckless optimism of someone who thinks the frontier promises gold. Others were lean and used in the way travelers are used by distance. People would sit at the station and hear the story of the woman who had come in rags, and the man who had kept a ledger, and the boy who had become a telegraph operator. Children listened and learned that courage can be measured in small things, and that love is often not a declaration, but a habit. On clear evenings, when the frost painted the glass and the sky had that hard blue a day makes when the sun is cold, one could stand by the station window and watch the empty road disappear into white. If one listened, perhaps too wishfully, there might be a faint echo of a laugh and the sound of a train whistle. It would not be the shout of destiny or the boom of triumph. It would be quieter, more honest, the sound of people who had chosen to remain and to care for one another. The small music of lives tied together by a patchwork of ordinary bravery.